So today I'm going to talk about the range of digital methods that we employ at the Royal Commission in the survey and interpretation of and the engagement with the built environment in Wales. And firstly, I'm going to say thank you to Chris for his talk, because that's allowed you to understand about how we go about reconstructing sort of lost built heritage. So I don't have to go into that detail, so you've got that background already. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the recording and understanding of historic buildings in Wales has been a fundamental part of the Commission's survey and investigation team since our inception in 1908. And before I jump into how our digital work has developed, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of how our survey and dissemination in the built heritage developed throughout the 20th century. That demonstrates that although some of the technologies we use today may be quite innovative, our core aim of how ensuring that historic buildings in Wales are recorded for the future and the understanding of them is disseminated as widely as possible remains the same. So our earliest inventories showcase numerous plans and elevations that are the work of one man, Mervyn Pritchard, who was an architect employed by Her Majesty's Office of Works, and who was loaned to the Royal Commission specifically for the purpose of illustrating the inventories. And these illustrations range from numerous pen and ink plans and elevations, which can be seen across the inventories here of Denbighshire, Carmarthenshire and Merioneth, to the much more evocative wash drawing of St Asaph Cathedral, which formed the frontispiece of the Denbighshire Flintshire inventory in 1912. His drawings for the Pembrokeshire inventory are particularly interesting. These were produced in the studio as tracings from investigative photographs which were taken in 1922. And there's a sort of lack of detail in these that wouldn't really classify them as records, yet they do transmit the nature and qualities of the subject very admirably. In the 1920s, the development in professional archaeology, combined with a very critical review by Mortimer Wheeler of that same Pembrokeshire inventory, which had been published in 1927, led to a change in direction under the Commission, led by Commissioner Cyril Fox. And it was under his guidance that buildings investigators made the shift to more intensive fieldwork and detailed measured survey using tapes and chains, providing a full record of each site with analytical plans and elevations that we would recognise as the basis for archaeological building survey as we carry it out today. And the first fruits of this development were seen in the Anglesey inventory in 1937 and 3 volumes of the Carmarthenshire industry published between 1956 and 1964. So the realisation came, however, that it was this marriage of the accurate survey and recording with the ability to create an illustration that could explain a complex history and engage the professional and general audience alike that was vitally important. And nowhere was this better utilised than the 1975 Commission publication Houses of the Welsh Countryside. Published in Architectural Heritage Year under the joint hand of Peter Smith and graphics officer Dylan Roberts, this study was a new departure for the Commission in many ways. It was the first thematic study of a building type rather than a simple parish by parish listing of buildings, such as we saw in the inventories. And in turn, this created a necessity for a new kind of visual representation that could be as interpretive or even more so than the text. And so this book heralded the golden age of the isometric and cutaway drawing, depicting building types that could be understood almost independently of the text and showing at a glance the form and detail of each house. For the first time since Pritchard's drawing of St Asaph Cathedral, buildings were depicted with the addition of people, furniture, animals, adding a sense of life and reality to the academic accuracy. It was admitted by the illustrators that such props could also provide a more practical purpose, as trees, bushes, fires could all be sort of helpfully employed to perhaps fill in the areas where a lack of surviving evidence prevented the more confident reconstruction. And to create the level of detail that you see in these printed works, the original drawings were carried out at 5 times the final printed scale. And as the field survey was carried out by the investigators, focused very much on creating the plan topologies, the illustrators themselves would often go into the field to supplement these with drawings specifically for the basis of their reconstructions. The other prominent feature which made its debut in the House of the Welsh countryside was the distribution map. And for the first time, the intensive study of pan-Wales house types and individual architectural elements could be used to create maps that were interpretive, in some cases defining vernacular regions such as the geographically restricted Snowdonia house. And the use of these 2 types of graphics contributed considerably to House of the Welsh countryside being hailed as a seminal work, not just in the academic study of vernacular architecture, but as a methodology for the visual dissemination of such research. And it led to a very different way of thinking internally, allowing a partnership of detailed recording, research and interpretation within the commission to be cemented. These techniques were developed and employed over the next couple of decades, being particularly well utilised with the new sphere of industrial archaeology, where exploded diagrams of complex structures and reconstructed landscapes benefit from the skills of surveyors and illustrators alike. And by the time Houses and History of the Marches of Wales, Radnorshire 1400 to 1800 was published, the author in his preface stated that the text to some extent is an extended commentary on the reconstruction drawings rather than the other way around. Houses of Radnorshire also marked an end to one era and the start of a new one, however, with the introduction of digital survey into the survey and investigation team in 2005, radically changing the landscape of both recording and dissemination. And it's this last sort of 15, 16 years of development and the change in digital techniques I'm going to focus on now. And what I'm going to do is take you through a fairly rapid series of case studies that illustrate how our methodologies have developed and refined in that time. So our first move into digital building survey was with the use of a combination of reflectorless total stations, a software called VOLT and AutoCAD. So this allowed us to work into the field as surveyors in a similar way to the creation of a measured pencil drawing, selecting individual points which are measured by the total station and translated into a drawn line in AutoCAD in real time. And the main difference between this and a pencil drawing is the fact that it's quicker, it's more accurate, it isn't limited by access, and it creates a real-time 3-dimensional wireframe model of the building you're recording in the field as you can see it, ensuring all the elements are recorded accurately in relationship to each other. And this example, which appears in the book, is Denbighshire Hall, which is the very first site I worked on after joining the commission in 2005. And the principal outputs from this wireframe survey are still very much the traditional 2D scale plans and elevations, which, although they're in a digital format, can be made accessible to a wide audience. The ability to record 3-dimensionally, however, enabled us to start thinking about marrying the greater capabilities of digital data with the tradition of the cutaway and isometric drawing that we were familiar with, and increasing the accessibility in understanding to a wider audience. So Denby Town Hall had been surveyed as part of the Denby Town Heritage Initiative, which was funded by Heritage Lottery Fund. It was a project that had been carried out jointly with Denby Town and County Councils. It had a public interest, and the town hall itself had been the focus of a history project by a Year 4 class at the local primary school. So the building had a very complex history. The hall had been constructed in 1573 by Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester and then Baron of Denby, which had undergone major remodelling in the late 18th century, Victorian additions and a major overhaul during conversion to a public library in the 1970s. So the idea was to make a 3D depiction of the phased building, allowing the children to be able to associate the interpretation of the history with the building they actually, you visualize the building in 3D. So to be able to let them associate the interpretation with the building that they had in front of them. And the result, in line with the fairly rudimentary skills that we had in the commission at this time, and what is a very new area of work for us, do look a little bit crude now. It looks a little bit dated, but it did reap very positive results in engaging with school children and others. Nextly, the Commission was thrown into the deep end when it became involved in the Wrexham Borough Council nomination of the Pontcysylltu Aqueduct in Llangollen Canal for World Heritage status. I understand you visited this site yesterday. So the nomination was underway on the basis of the revolutionary design used by the engineers William Jessup and Thomas Telford for the construction of the high-level Chirk and Pontcysylltu aqueducts, which ensured that the 11-mile stretch of canal between Gledrid and the Horseshoe Falls didn't have to have a single lock. Pontcysylltu Aqueduct in particular had a very complicated trough and towpath structure of cast iron, as well as very important hidden detail within the piers that were all vital to explain as they held the key to the importance of the structure as World Heritage. And the advantage of replicating these as a 3D model ensured that all the elements could then be picked apart and examined in detail from any viewpoint. And in this instance, the creation of 3D modelling was informed by a vast archive of two-dimensional material from the very original Thomas Telford engineering drawings of the 1970s through to modern structural surveys carried out by British Waterways. So this was the first time we sort of translated sort of 2D archive into 3D form. Equally important was the constructional sequence of building the aqueduct and the logistics of that. Money had been made available from the nomination fund, which allowed us to approach a visualisation company who utilised the modelling that we had created in-house to produce our first animation. And this 8-minute film allowed us to explain clearly the entire process involved in raising the structure, from building the cofferdams, the tram lines, and scaffolding involved in raising the piers and the laying of the trough. Something that was otherwise extremely difficult to envisage or to explain in a written form. And this played a major part in the nomination process and has a very long reuse life, both in video form and with stills being used in publications and promotional materials. So the aqueduct in its interpretive animation went on to be included in a story in the first series of Hidden Histories, a BBC Wales documentary series on the work of the Commission. The expectations of the TV producer to be able to showcase this sort of digital interpretation in the second series gave us a small budget to look at a very different animation. A Bont was an artwork by the North Wales architect Jonah Jones, commissioned by Coleg Harlech in 1968. Consisting of 427 individual pieces of marble, the installation was wrapped around 4 sides of a lift shaft within the newly constructed student halls of residence. Due for demolition, it was key to be able to capture the context of the work, not only within the physical confines of the walls and the furniture of the canteen that it was placed in, but also the important part that light, which entered the room through the 3 windowed walls to the south, west and east, played on it throughout the day, which was an important factor in Jonah Jones's vision for the piece. So the background colour of the piece, which had been altered by the later application of blue emulsion, and elements that had been broken or lost could also all be restored. And the whole could also be virtually unwrapped, allowing the viewer to see the sculpture as a continuous whole, which in real life it couldn't be, which meant that the meaning of the piece, which is education as a bridge between the sort of wild and unruly natural world and the order brought about through learning, more accessible. In 2010, Flick, a television production company working with S4C, approached the Commission with the idea of celebrating 35 years of Houses of the Welsh countryside through a 6-part television series, Cartrefi Cefn Gwlad Cymru, with an accompanying book, each segment devoted to a different house type. The aim was to introduce a new audience to the original publication, but a focal point for the project was to utilise what was then state-of-the-art technology to enhance the original illustrations through digitally creating the forms of the houses and to witness the centuries of change due to fashion, neglect and restoration stripped away within minutes. In each episode, an exemplar house of the type studied was chosen for recreation, this example being Bryn Drynnog, originally a timber-framed great house of 1436, with numerous later additions and alterations. And nearly all of these had been previously depicted in the original traditional cutaway drawings. All 6 of the houses still existed, although one in a ruined form, and the task was to take the viewer from the building as it was filmed in the modern day as part of the TV series, peeling back later extensions and coverings and restoring both the interiors and exteriors to show the original form and layout. And because these were based on the original cutaway drawings, we thought it would be a reasonably simple task to sort of recreate those in digital form. However, the modelling process in itself, as Chris has sort of shown in his talk, becomes a major work in reinterpretation of each house, and the coverage and the detail that was involved in an animation that shows multiple, if not all, viewpoints of an interior and exterior went far beyond that which earlier illustrators had needed to achieve. And it threw up a multiple of new questions about the form and detailing of the architecture, which we then needed to research and answer before the work could progress. The idea of how modelling and animation can be used as part of the research process in its own right, rather than merely displaying information as a sort of visual tool, was highlighted during the 2012 Havard and Morva Copperworks project, an AHRC-funded research project into Swansea's copper industry. In the 19th century, Swansea was the copper smelting capital of the world, producing over half the global output of smelted copper, and Havard was the largest of 11 copper works in the city. With substantial decline through the first half of the 20th century, much of the industrial landscape was destroyed during a regeneration scheme of the 1960s, and all that now remains of the copperworks are these 2 derelict engine houses, one containing the only original in situ single cylinder Musgrove engine in the UK. So these are all that represent the small part of the works that continued in use. So those works closed in 2002 and had been recorded by the Commission as a series of 2D pencil drawings and black and white photography. And by combining this survey with a wealth of the archive material, including an invaluable photographic documentation of the works undertaken by the then owners Imperial Chemicals in the late 1920s, we were able to reconstruct the machinery and buildings, and we were able to produce an animated film that explained the processes of smelting and production in a way that would be understandable for the general public, but also to a standard that would satisfy the most ardent of industrial archaeologists. And those of you who know industrial archaeologists, that is quite a task. So, as I said, the modelling, detailing, sequencing that goes into the production of such an animation isn't just a visualisation process, but one of intense research and re-evaluation of what we knew about the site, the processing that took place, and how the machinery worked. And this is the core behind our work. And the animations do aim to be engaging and accessible, but the underlying principle is to maintain that same level of accuracy and knowledge as any of our more traditional forms of publication, knowing that they will be scrutinised in exactly the same way. And again, this cemented our realisation that even for sites which supposedly are previously well understood and extensively researched, the detail that you need for such a resource does require a much greater depth of understanding. And at this point, while the initial modelling of the machinery was done in-house, the scale and complexity of these sort of productions mean that much of the modelling and animation work now is contracted out to external visualisation companies. And this does require a very close working relationship to be created quite quickly between us as the sort of interpreters and the external graphics artists who often have no background in archaeology or heritage. And that flexibility of that relationship for them to learn very quickly, and for them to tell us when we need to stop, which is quite an important point. Digital Descent was a project aimed at creating a virtual museum telling the story of nonconformity and its buildings through a series of engaging, meaningful and informative resources, funded again by the HLF and in partnership with RCAHMW, the Welsh Religious Buildings Trust. And central to this project was the research into and the development of a series of more digitally innovative technologies and techniques specifically asked for by the funding body for recording and interpretation of our built heritage. With the creation of a project-specific website, one of the tasks we wanted to tackle was a mapping resource. So as Argwin said, the Commission has carried out a very long-term thematic recording project on nonconformist chapels, creating a database of nearly 6,500 chapels across Wales. We wanted to make this available in its entirety on the website. And going back to the idea of the distribution maps and houses of the Welsh countryside, an important function of the site was to be able to create statistical and geographical analysis of the database through the mapping of denominations, architectural styles, architects, language. And the use of GIS internally makes the production of such maps now sort of virtually instantaneous. But rather than create a series of static, pre-prepared maps that we had in-house the Welsh countryside, we were keen to be able to replicate that interactive GIS capability with an interactive mapping page that would allow users to create combinations of whichever fields they were interested in. And so on this website, there's the ability for the user to create a simple facet searching down the side where they can choose, filter down the information they want to see displayed, and with limits using colour schemes to create their own set of graphics and their own set of maps. And you can also create more complicated queries through the advanced search system. And either way, the emphasis is allowing the user to display the information relevant to them. The second area of work was the recording and interpretation of 4 of the chapels held in trust by RCAHMW. And their remit as a charity is to conserve and preserve for future generations the very best examples of nonconformist architecture and history, and to ensure that the important stories around these buildings continue to be told. And the first area of recording that we looked at was photographic, and we decided to employ the technique of gigapixel photography. So gigapixel photography is the creation of a 360-degree sphere, photographic sphere, which is made up of around 450 individual detailed photographs stitched together. So this allows someone to virtually visit the chapel, stand in a spot and be able to look all around them, as well as being able to zoom into the sphere to look at further details. And in terms of both recording and understanding, particularly of an interior, the advantage is being able to visually see all the elements captured by the photography in relation to each other and the overall building, rather than looking at a series of separate photographs and having to assess how the elements within those photographs relate to each other locationally. By putting a number of these photospheres together into a tool, it then further allows for different parts of the building to be related to each other and for visitors anywhere to virtually visit a site. And then this tool can be further enhanced with the addition of embedded information in the form of historical images, text, video or audio clips that can add a level of narrative. In addition to recording the chapels through photographs, detailed metric survey of the building was also required. So working in partnership with Aberystwyth University and their robotics department, we were able to laser scan all 4 of the buildings, a technique which captures considerably more data far more quickly than using the total station, and creates extremely detailed and accurate point clouds of the interiors and exteriors of each of the 4 chapels. So not only this data, this form data that gives you a record of the building that can be archived within the National Monuments Record, but it can be used to inform the programme of conservation, of repair, of restoration on behalf of the Trust's architects, and it can also form the basis for interpretive animation telling the story of the building. And although these point clouds are essentially raw survey data, the final registered point clouds, when they're brought together for each chapel, are very visually engaging. So it was decided just to create a very quick fly through of each of these, allowing the user to experience a tour of the chapel as it is now. And the response to that, you can spend all the money on all the expensive reconstructions in the world. These are what people love. The response to these has been quite overwhelming and described as magical, fairy-like, ghostly. And it just shows that sometimes the engagement you can get with people can come from quite unlikely things. When looking at the interpretive side of this, we were keen to look at advancing our methodology beyond the previous animations that we'd carried out. The ever-increasing growth in the gaming industry has given people an expectation of both a much higher level of graphics than the average heritage sector organisation can afford. There's also given an expectation of interactivity, the opportunity to move around within a three-dimensional environment rather than passively watching a set-length film. And so with this in mind, we worked with two companies with an experience in the gaming industry. And Hen Cwrdd is a Unitarian chapel in Trecynon with a wealth of interesting stories relating to its denominational history, architecture, and the importance of the chapel in the educational and social lives of its members, but also to Welsh culture, including Iolo Morgannwg and the bardic tradition and Eisteddfodau, and the social and cultural life of the town. So what we created here was a model that the user can wander around the 3D environment of the chapel using the Unity gaming platform, and they encounter various objects around the chapel, such as the tea set here, which you can then click on, and that will trigger text, images, and audio clips that tell you the stories of the chapel. And a similar environment is being created for the Chapel of Hen Gapel Rhydain in Ceredigion. In this case, the information objects placed throughout the environment are a series of books that people can virtually turn the pages and read the stories. So ranging from the different phases of the building history to its links with Frank Lloyd Wright, for example. But we also created two reconstructive experiences. So one was being part of the crowd, listening to Gwilym Morles's famous sermon on the steps after the Troed Allan of 1876. And the other was an experience of actually sitting, being one of the congregation, sitting within a crowded chapel, listening to the sermon. Both were beautifully done by our contractors and were very well received by the public, particularly by school groups and other younger users. However, we will be honest and say this does highlight the downsides sometimes of trying to do things which are too digitally innovative. Within 18 months of the project completion, Google decided and announced it was no longer supporting the Unity platform, and so access to these resources on the website disappeared from anybody who wasn't using Internet Explorer, and I don't know how many people are still using Internet Explorer, so basically nobody. So while the resources are still available for us to be used as talks and shows and in schools, and that sort of global impact has disappeared, and that is something that you sort of do have to weigh up, and there has to be an acceptance, particularly when it's coming from funders. That sometimes when you're dealing with new technologies, there might be a short shelf life. One of our most recent projects is Journey to the Past, which we did in 2018. This was a project carried out in partnership with Bangor University and the Centre for Welsh and Celtic Studies in Aberystwyth. And it was again carried out with funding from AHRC, with the aim specifically of using more innovative forms of recording and dissemination techniques to further information that had been collated in a previous project, European Travellers to Wales. So this has been a project which had created a database recording the writings of French and German travellers to Wales between 1750 and the present day, collecting their descriptions of buildings, archaeological sites, industry, and cultural traditions. And the task of this project was to use technology to form a bridge between the experiences of those travellers and modern day visitors. So the first task was to identify those historic sites which are best represented with detailed descriptions in the writings. And these range from sites that people were visiting as picturesque tourists, experiencing Welsh history, such as Caerphilly Castle at the top here, to sites that we would consider historic today, but were for them the latest examples of innovation in engineering and industry, which included the opening ceremony for the Menai Bridge, for example. And in order to replicate the visits they made to the historic sites in town, we again used this idea of the Gigapixel tour to create an online sort of Gigapixel Photography to create an online tour of a number of sites. And here we've got Valley Crucis, which I think again you were yesterday, again with a level of narrative embedded with embedded archive images, text or video. So Valley Crucis, which was described by Marianne Bovet, as an incoherent tumbling of vaguely Gothic ruins surrounded by a venerable cemetery where the tombstones are still legible if totally unpronounceable, but slightly more kindly, if geographically incorrect, by Samuel Henry Spiker as one of the most picturesque ruins in England. They didn't often perhaps quite get the differentiation between England and Wales, but this is a site which obviously is an extremely fine example of a Cistercian monastery, extremely beautiful landscapes in close proximity to a number of other sites, such as Dinas Bran and Elysys Pillar and Llangollen, but actually it is remarkably under-recognised and under-visited by tourists even within the UK. So the idea is that this sort of online resource will inspire people to engage further with the history and architecture of the site, and that virtual visit will then hopefully subsequently encourage a physical one. Just very short, another sort of very quick thing we did to play with photography was the commission holds a number of stereo photographs which date from the late 19th century, early 20th century. And again, just as a play for how you could just add a little bit of life to these, we used a software called Photomorph, which just takes the two stereo images, and just by combining the two and adding a slight bit of movement, it gives us a slight sense of three-dimensionality to the photo. So that was just a very little thing that we played around with. Oh, I didn't realise there was going to be music on. So another site which is obviously very local, so I don't know whether you visited this yesterday, so this is St Winifred's Well, was captured using laser scanning and a fly-through of the point cloud data. So this is a site which has been a pilgrimage for Catholics since at least the early 12th century, known as the Lourdes of Wales, and claimed to being the oldest continually visited pilgrimage site in the UK. And this was a very common stop for both Catholic, French and Protestant German travellers throughout the period we were looking at. Many of whom took the waters, although again, as Samuel Spiker noted, it is not easy to bring one's mind to taste it. Both the internal and external basins are used for bathing. So I don't think he was very keen, and I don't think it's something most of us would do today, but it was a very common stop. As I mentioned, some of the travellers were specifically travelling to Wales, the opportunities it offered in reporting back on the enormous strides that were being undertaken in industry, whether that be the slate quarrying of North Wales, copper smelting in Swansea, or at Merthyr, the destination for many industrial spies was the ironworking. And here writers such as Alphonse Esquerros and Louis Simonin were equally in awe and admiration of the industrial advances of Cyfarthfa and Dowlais, and shocked by the conditions in which people worked and lived. And again, we combined, took these writings and we translated these into a multimedia film, utilising some reconstruction animation alongside illustrative archive material. But again, as I say, the funding again requested a level of digital innovation as well as refinements of techniques we had previously used. And mindful of the digital trends and public expectations and what the wider world is doing, we looked at creating a slightly different virtual tour of a key site on the picturesque tourism trail. And the descriptions of the travellers' reaction to Tintern Abbey in the earlier 19th century are particularly evocative, capturing the very emotional response that was affected by the rather wild and romantic ruin, which is very heavily covered in ivy and overgrown, which is perhaps missing from a visit to what is a very carefully conserved guardianship monument today, but perhaps takes away part of that magic that they experienced. In particular, it was very popular to visit the Abbey ruins at night, to be taken around by a local guide who would take them on wall-top walks, either by moonlight or the light of the sort of flaming torches. So to try and sort of recreate the more atmospheric mood that accompanies visitors, such as Carl von Heilbronner, for whom entering the darkness of the majestic halls, holy shivers animated the breast. We rebuilt Tintern Abbey in the mid-19th century using virtual reality, and using a VR headset such as the Oculus Rift, or putting your mobile phone into a cheaper version such as the Google Cardboard glasses. You can yourself wander around the Abbey complex either in a day or a night setting alongside other travellers of the period. And as you move around the Abbey, you'll encounter a series of travel guides that will tell you again about the site and its history and different stories. And again, this has been very, very popular with younger people and older people alike. And it's a very substantial sort of step forward in how you put people within a site, sort of immersed within the building, and experience the heritage in a way that's not really been possible before. It has been our first experiment in VR technology, and it's by no means perfect, and we have some way to go in learning how to best apply this technology. It is, again, that sort of balance of accuracy, information, and accessibility. So just very quickly now going forward, we are just about, hopefully, to start another project that will allow us to work further to develop this use of VR technology, as well as experimenting with a new technology in the form of augmented reality. And the former synagogue in Merthyr Tydfil, this is a building that dates to 1874, and it's the oldest surviving purpose-built synagogue in Wales. It was the third to be built in the town. Merthyr was one of two main Jewish centres within Wales, the other one being Cardiff, numbering some 400 Jews in the peak of the second half of the 19th century. And these included both a mercantile class, which served the rapidly expanding numbers of workers employed by the coal, iron and steel industries, as well as a community of Russian Jews who worked themselves in the Dowlice works. And although it was listed in 1978, the building was closed for worship in 1983, and through subsequent reuse has been largely stripped out before falling derelict in the early 2000s, and it has deteriorated very, very badly. However, a survey of historic synagogues by the Foundation of Jewish Heritage in 2017 has identified this as one of the four most important Jewish buildings in Europe, alongside synagogues in Belarus, Turkey and Spain. And the foundation has subsequently purchased the synagogue with the aim of creating a heritage centre of Jewish heritage in Wales, and have asked the Commission to work in partnership with them to use digital technologies to understand, reconstruct and explain the importance and the rich stories around this site. So, I mean, our first step has been, as with the other buildings, to ensure the site is laser scanned, to create an exact record of what survives, in particular the detailed carved stonework, timberwork and leaded glass that all needs careful conservation. However, with almost nothing left of the interior, the next thing we will consider will be moving forward to virtually recreating the synagogue as it was originally built and furnished, using again an array of historical and comparative sources. Our main challenge will be how we can use the different techniques to adapt that reconstruction to a wide range of resources which are desired by the foundation to fulfil quite a wide range of different audiences. So they're aware that they need to engage a global audience with this. They're aware that for ongoing sort of maintenance, they need to get people engaged and hopefully donating money to this, but also to people coming to as physical visitors to the building. So there's no intention to refit the interior of the synagogue as it was by the foundation. So we're looking towards the use of augmented reality. So unlike virtual reality, where a user is immersed and to an extent quite isolated in a fully virtual world within a headset and actual movements quite limited, augmented reality allows the virtual world to be overlain onto the real world via a pair of quite normal looking glasses. So this has the advantage of people actually being able to correlate more easily what they see today with the reconstruction and interpretation. And similarly to previous projects, we also want to be able to explain and interpret how the interior was used, the congregation, the daily rituals of Jewish worship, special events, and an understanding for what it meant to be part of this community. So continuing our aim of not just explaining a building in terms of its architecture, but its social, cultural, and community context. So this is our next project. Fingers crossed that we get the funding and it goes ahead. Otherwise, it's a case of watch this space. And that was a very quick romp through to a lot of different sites. The digital version of our booklet is available on our website. All our animations are available on the Royal Commission YouTube channel. I didn't want to sort of get into showing lots of them today because technology doesn't always work that well, but do go and have a look at them. And thank you.